Let's talk about SketchUp today. And SketchUp is a great 3D modeling software. There is a kind of free online interface that you can use, but we are going to be using SketchUp Pro, which has the full set of tools. It's a great application, and it's available to students for only $49. So I would say get yourself a copy today. Let's first start and just kind of talk about the launch screen. SketchUp wants to help you to learn SketchUp, and there's a whole blog and a great online community with lots and lots of information. There's also something called Sketchucation, which is an online site for educational videos. And of course, there are my videos. And then SketchUp wants you to choose a template. Obviously, if we were part of the rest of the world, we would use some kind of metric template. For us, the architectural template is fine. In fact, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. It just changes the way the background looks and the default units. And I always uncheck this button here. Don't always do it because I only have to do it once, and then this thing won't show up every time I start using SketchUp. So let's start with the Windows version of SketchUp interface and go through the basic pieces. What you'll find is that the SketchUp drawing interface, user interface, is very similar to a lot of the other drawing programs we have. There's a big drawing area. There are some basic tools up at the top, and then there are some pull-down menus. And like other programs, the pull-down menus generally repeat tools that are showing up somewhere on a toolbar. Although right now SketchUp default setting is to have very few buttons visible. You'll also see on the Windows version a palette filled with menus, and these menus allow you to do a number of different things, kind of like the properties menu in AutoCAD and the layers menu. In fact, there even is a layers menu right here, so it should look familiar. Now, there are some differences, of course. First of all, less is done with layers in SketchUp. It's just the way it works. But other than that, generally you do draw geometry and then edit it. That's kind of the same as AutoCAD and other programs. The big difference here is that everything is three-dimensional. So starting with just moving around the space, obviously there's a person here. You can see an X and Y axes and also a Z axis. Now these axes are colored conveniently red, green, and blue, respectively. And that helps you to orient around the space. Now, if I click and drag my scroll wheel, you'll see that the space orbits around. That's called orbiting. It basically rotates it around in 3 dimensions. There is a tool for that up in the toolbar, and it's called Orbit. So when you see me rotating the space, that's what I'll be doing. You can also pan, just like in AutoCAD, and you can click in the pan tool to move the drawing space back and forth. But you can also click and drag the scroll wheel and the left mouse button. Clicking and dragging both of those at the same time activates the pan command. So often people will zoom and then pan, all without having to move their mouse away from the center of the screen. So those are the basics of the interface. Now, the last thing I want to mention, for those of you who like to have kind of a little guide along as you are exploring this 3D world, there is something called the instructor, which is over here in the tool palette. If you are on a Mac, you'll have to go to the window pull-down menu and look for the instructor tool palette. But here it's in the PC version alive. And what it does is anytime you have a tool selected, so right now I have the select tool selected, it will tell you, oh, here's how you use it. You just click on an entity. And then it even gives you modifiers, kind of like the command line readout in AutoCAD. Control adds an entity, Shift and Control subtracts an entity. So if I hold down Shift and Control, which of course you can't see, it will remove the object from the selection set. By the way, when you are using the select command, or select tool, it operates the same way as AutoCAD does, which is to say you have crossing windows and selection windows. If I drag to the left, click and drag to the left, you will see a dashed line, again, just like in AutoCAD, and off to the right is a selection window. Only objects entirely within that window are selected, whereas the crossing window, anything that is touched is selected. Okay, so why don't we take a look at a couple of the basic tools, and we'll draw a few random shapes. For this, I'm going to use the PC version. Either way, the Mac users should be able to follow along, no problem. The commands look basically the same. First up is the eraser tool. And if you leave your mouse over the tool, you'll get a tool tip, which describes how to use it. For some of these tools, there'll actually be a little video. Now, this tool, it's not too hard to use. You just click it, and you drag over some item and it erases it. By the way, undo is Control-Z if you don't want to erase something. Now, next up is the pencil tool, okay? And it does exactly what you think it would do, which is it draws on the ground. Now, one thing you'll notice is that you can snap to the origin, unlike in AutoCAD. Also, it will kind of snap to any of the three cardinal directions. So you can use that if you want to draw orthogonally. You can snap along these lines. You can also, if you see my tooltip pop up, I am drawing off from that last point. It recognizes that this is the green axis. This also recognizes it's the red axis. And I can even snap. You see how I'm getting a dot, which indicates a snap right to the axis. And there we go. When I continue drawing that loop, when it gets to the end, it will fill it in. And SketchUp is basically a surface modeling program, which is to say it likes to draw with surfaces. This is a surface here. Individual lines, and I'll just draw a couple, are not bounded, which is to say they don't form a continuous loop, so they won't fill in, so it's a lot harder to do anything with that individual line. But as soon as you fill them in, they create a surface. Now you'll notice that I drew that vertically. That wasn't on purpose. You have to be very aware when you draw in SketchUp that everything is three-dimensional, so you have to be cognizant of which axes you're drawing in. What I find is that keeping your cursor near the crosshairs of the X, Y, and Z axis helps with that. Okay, so those are basic lines. By the way, if you want to select a line, a surface, you can click on it using the select command and just delete it just by hitting the delete button. And now it's a hollow surface. You can also click on an individual line and delete that, but when you do that, the entire surface goes away. Note that anytime you don't have a continuous boundary, the surface that is formed by the boundary will disappear. So that's the line tool. By the way, there are other tools hidden underneath these. Again, this is very similar to most other programs. That teeny tiny little down arrow indicates other tools. The freehand tool allows you to draw funny shapes, and those are, a little more freeform. All right, the arc tool. There are several different arc tools, again, just like in other drawing programs. So if you want to draw an arc, say, on this surface, I could use these two endpoints and then draw the arc like so. I can also draw the arc vertically. See how by making reference, by moving my mouse over the blue axis, I can draw an arc vertically. So again, these reference axes, just by moving your mouse near them, you can make the cursor reference them. Rectangles are the very simple one, looks like we actually just drew one with lines, but you can draw one using the rectangle tool. In fact, there are even other tools hiding under here. There's one that's kind of fun called the rotated rectangle, and I'll just zoom over here, which is to say you can draw a rectangle up in space. See how it's drawing it both in shape and up at an angle. A little harder to control what angle you're at, but awfully handy if you are trying to draw a rectangle up in space. Anyway, and I can draw a circle. I can even draw a polygon, and I'll draw that on my rectangle here. Notice, by the way, down in the lower right, there is a value control box here. And what this does, certain tools have numerical modifiers. And in this case, the number of sides can be modified. I could type in 8, for example, and I'll hit enter, and it will change this shape to have 8 sides instead of the default value of 5. So that value control box is awfully handy. You'll also want to notice that whatever the last command used in this stack, that remains at the top. Okay, so those are our 2D drawing tools. Now let's go into what SketchUp excels at, which is 3D drawing. And first of all, the most basic 3D tool is push-pull. Okay, and I'll just click on push-pull. And what it does, it's kind of like a Play-Doh extruder. You click on some surface, and it has to be a surface, and then you move your mouse either up or down, and it extrudes that surface. And you can do that with pretty much any surface, so long as it doesn't interfere with others. So for example, this surface here, I can only go down because the geometry of the arch won't allow it to pull up. So you can create a number of different kinds of shapes using the push-pull tool. You can also use what's called the offset tool. Let me get myself a nice handy circle here. The offset tool is very straightforward. You move your mouse over a surface and you see how it highlights the surface, and then you can click and drag that boundary line, and I'll try it here with this octagon. You can click and drag that boundary line to get an offset, and I'll just push-pull that up, and there you go. By the way, every command in SketchUp does have a quick launch kind of shortcut. Unfortunately, it doesn't show it to you when you leave your mouse over the toolbar. You have to go to the Draw or Tools menu. So for example, Lines, the shortcut is L. Under the Tools menu, Push-Pull is P. And you will find that the keyboard shortcut guide that I have included with the course is super handy. You have to do something with that other hand, and rather than just drink coffee, and being able to do the keyboard shortcuts will save you some time. I will try to remember to click the buttons and not just do the keyboard shortcut so that you can see what I'm doing for at least this first lecture. So what you'll see with the offset tool is that if you click once to start the tool, you will have a readout in the value control box of how far you've come from that point, the sort of displacement value. Well, you can type in a number and hit enter, and it will just offset that value. Okay, and this is a great way to kind of get kind of concentric boxes, and then you can push-pull those boxes to your heart's content. There you go. You'll notice, by the way, that the color of the boxes does change. This is the default color for all objects. It hasn't been painted or anything. And basically the outside face is this sort of grayish-blue face. White is the inside. For our purposes at this stage, it actually doesn't matter all that much, but if it's bothering you, if you're wondering why it does that, that's why. Now, the next tool that we're going to learn is the Move tool. And the Move tool works pretty straightforward. Is you just select an object and you move it. And as we saw before, you can click on objects to get like a surface, and you can move a surface if the geometry that you create when you move the surface is allowable. You see how it stretches the geometry? If it's not geometrically possible, SketchUp won't allow you to move the object, okay? But usually it will allow you to do it. And you can select a line and move that. In fact, if I have nothing selected, so I'll click the select command, click out in outer space, so nothing is selected. When I hit the Move command, I can let SketchUp automatically select the objects. You see how it highlights them, either the surface, the line, or this endpoint. I can move endpoints either up, down, left, or right. Again, SketchUp will try to modify the geometry so that it kind of automatically warps to make whatever shape you want. Okay, now that's basic selection, but what if I want to select a surface and its bounding edges, not just the surface? Well, to do that, I use the select command and I double click on a surface, and I get the surface and its bounding edges. If I just click once, I just get the surface. If I triple click on an object, and I'll just do that right now, 1, 2, 3, it will select the surface, its bounding edges, and anything that's touching those edges directly. So you see how that's a quick way to get the entire 3D object selected. What does quadruple clicking do? Nothing. It doesn't do anything, but I just thought I'd ask to see if anybody cares. All right, there you go. So those are some quick ways to select objects. I'll triple click this object and I can then click the move command. You don't have to click on an object to move it. And note that objects do have essentially O-snaps, object snaps, like endpoints and midpoints. So if you want to move an object so that it touches some other object by the endpoint, for example, you can do that if you can find the endpoint active. You see, there's the endpoint and this other object. Now, note that objects are sticky in SketchUp. So if I now move this object, look, it's stuck onto that other object. And that is the source of much misery in SketchUp, although it's also the thing which allows us to push-pull and do other tools. Okay, so other tools that we can use are, well, let's try rotate. Here, I'll rotate these guys here. And again, I'll use my select command, triple click on this surface to get everything. And then I can use the rotate tool. The way that it works is you click the tool, you get a kind of protractor, and when you plant the protractor, that is the origin point. And if you're like, how did you know that? If you look down at the bottom of your screen, it's telling you what you need to know to operate the tool. Again, kind of like the command line. Notice though that as I go over a vertical surface, the protractor flips up. And that is really handy if you want to rotate something around some vertical axis. But note that it can also be a little disorienting, and you can force SketchUp to either go horizontally by tapping the up arrow, or in the red, rotate in the red plane, or the green plane just by tapping the right arrow or the left arrow, respectively. Then I can plant this anywhere I want, and it won't flip sideways, and I can get a rotation in an exact plane. Now, as I'm rotating, notice that it snaps to every 15 degrees or so, and it also snaps to 90, 270, 180, etc. You can also type in a number. So if I typed in 45 and enter, for example, I can rotate at a very specific angle. That is the lovely rotate command. Now, the next one that we're going to learn is the scale tool. Okay, and the scale tool is very straightforward. It's very graphical. So here's my object that I've already pre-selected. I'll just click the tool, and now you have all these grips here. And again, they are very similar to AutoCAD grips when you click and drag on them, or click once and allow your cursor to move around. You can modify the object in a very straightforward manner. Each one does something different, so it will describe in the tooltip what it does, but frankly, I never really totally understand what the tooltips are telling me. So I kind of have to play with it just to get a feel for what's going on and what each tool does. So there you go. The scale tool is quite straightforward. Grabbing the corners, by the way, will scale it without distorting it. So that's the one I use the most. You will also notice on the lower right that our value control box is reading out how much we're scaling it. So if you want it exactly, say 150%, just type in 1.5 and enter, and it will scale it an exact amount. And that little trick works with every value that can be entered in that value control box. All right, so there you go. That's the basics. To end the commands, by the way, I just use the select tool. So that's the scale tool. And then finally, the last tools are pretty straightforward. There's a tape measure tool. You can probably guess. It measures objects. So if I click on one point and then get to another point, it will measure that object. One thing to notice though, by the way, if you click on that second point, or if I click off of this point and move a line, it will put in what's called a reference line. Okay, and people use these reference lines quite a lot when they're laying out a space. For example, here, let me undo that, and I'll make a reference line that is, oh, I don't know, 3 feet from the plan. Then maybe I make another reference line that's another 3 feet. See how I'm using my value control box. You can set up a little grid for yourself, which will allow you to snap to it. So when you're drawing, say, here, let's draw a rectangle. You can snap to that grid, okay? Very handy. So those are the basic drawing tools. The text tool is a funny one because we are in a 3D environment. The text tool, first of all, if you click where there's nothing, if you don't click on anything, there's nothing to point at, it will just put a piece of text out in kind of, essentially it puts it on your screen, I guess is one way to look at it. So you see how as I zoom in, that text doesn't move. It's kind of pinned to that location. Now this is different from when you put a piece of text in when you click on an object. Now this is different from when you click on an object. Move your mouse off and I'll just right click to complete the text. When you click on an object, it will give you information about that object. So for example, clicking on the object below gives me the area of the surface. Clicking on a component, however, will give me the name of the component. The last tool that we're going to use up here that's a modifying tool is the paint bucket. We love the paint bucket. The paint bucket is so fun. The Mac and Windows versions have slightly different ways of handling materials. Let me just stretch this out a little bit. First of all, when you click on the paint bucket, the materials menu pops up. Now, the Mac users didn't have any menus visible, so this is the first menu that will pop up for you. And then you can just click on a color, move your mouse over a surface, and click to paint. That's really hard. And there are quite a few different types of things that you can paint as a default. For example, we can paint carpet. Okay, and of course, SketchUp doesn't care what you paint on. It's not really paying attention to whether or not carpet makes any sense in that location. There are even glassy materials which are semi-transparent. And if you have an object selected and you use the paint bucket, it will paint the entire object. The Mac menu for materials is slightly different just in the kind of way it looks. It has all the same materials. You click on the little brick and that will get you the list that we saw on the PC side for different materials. If you click on the pencils, you get kind of a pencil view, and then you can also pick it kind of in a spectrum-y view or an RGB. Any of those are the same, and all the materials are basically the same. You can edit them, by the way. So if you paint some material on an object, you can, for example, modify its opacity so that it's less than 100% opaque. There we go. That may or may not be what you're looking for, but every material can be edited. In fact, if you right-click on a material, you can choose Edit. Let me just stretch this out a little bit so we can see it more clearly. There are all sorts of additional things that you can change. For example, if you want to make this a much smaller pattern, I can make this 1-inch pattern. When you click on the material to kind of update it, you will see that it's a much tighter material. Oh, I lost my opacity. There we go. So there are all sorts of things. You can also duplicate the material so you don't mess up the original, which I just did, and rename them. And you can even import new materials and from the images that you might have lying around just by using the import button. Also, notice that I can have one side of a material, of a surface, painted one color, but the back side is not painted that color, which is frankly a little trippy sometimes, but it's also very handy if you haven't drawn, say, wall thicknesses, so you have two surfaces on a wall. You can have one side of a plane be one material and one side be a different material. The last commands we've actually kind of already learned, orbit and pan. Now this next one, zoom, gives you a magnifying glass. If you click and drag up, you will zoom in on your model. If you click and drag down, you will zoom out. But one really cool feature of zoom is that you can change the field of view. And if I change that number, I'll change it to 65. What you'll see, I'll zoom in here, is that everything gets a lot more distorted. You see how the perspective distortion is much more dramatic here. That is really handy for interior views. Last tool here is Zoom Extents, and that kind of is a great tool for getting you out of trouble. It will basically zoom you out to every object it can find. So sometimes when you're working, you'll get really close in and you'll get lost inside a wall or a piece of furniture, which is a little peculiar. If you click Zoom Extents, it will zoom you out and you will be able to see all the object. It does not zoom you to the extents of these reference lines because they go on to infinity, so that would be pretty far. Let's actually draw something. I'm going to zoom extents, so I get way out here. I also think I'm going to get rid of these reference lines. I don't really need them. And we're going to just, and maybe I'll get rid of this label that's kind of glued to my screen. We don't need that. But what we're going to do, I'm going to pan out into outer space here, and we're going to draw kind of a little Greek temple. So when you draw something architectural, you definitely want to be as accurate as possible. And I happen to know the size of the base that we need for our little, and it's 80 feet by 44. So we need a rectangle. Click on the rectangle tool. You could also type in R, I believe, for rectangle. I'll click once to start the tool. And what you'll notice, the rectangle tool has a couple of tooltips that allow you to draw to certain proportions. So for example, if I move my mouse to roughly square, I get the square tooltip. If I move it over here to roughly the golden section proportion, I get the golden section tooltip. But I also have values down in my value control box. As I move my mouse, those numbers change. And of course, it's a little too fast for me to be able to just move my mouse to 80 and 44. But I can, without clicking in that box, just type in 80 feet. You do have to use the little apostrophe. And then comma, 44 feet. And when I hit enter, like magic, up pops my box of exactly the right size. And I can push-pull this up. Now remember, every tool that has a value, the operation of that tool, I can change the number. I'm going to type in just 9 and enter to get myself a 9-inch step. Okay, this only works immediately after the tool is operated. However, I can make changes multiple times. So if I'm like, oh, I don't like 9 inches, I'm going to make it 24. You see how I can come back and change it later on. Let's make another step. We'll use the offset tool for that. And like we learned before, you click once on the edge of the surface you want to offset, move your mouse in, and you can either click, I'm going to type in 12 for 12 inches and hit enter. And I'll push-pull up this object. By the way, if you double-click the push-pull tool, it will push-pull whatever amount you just push-pulled last time. Of course, it means you have to have used the tool earlier in the day. Now, I'm going to need a little reference line here for where to start my little colonnade. So let me offset this top by 2 feet, I believe, is the right number. There we go. Now, I could just start drawing my, I want to draw a colonnade, and I could just start drawing it right on top of this base. But good modeling procedures is to isolate this base geometry so it's not so sticky. Remember how when we moved objects, they would all get stretched out. The way that you do that is you select the base, and I'll just triple click on it, and then right click on it, and take advantage of this context menu and choose Make Group. And like in AutoCAD, a group is just a collection of different objects, and it's usually a one-off, an element where you're not going to be having 23 of these bases created in your project. Let's create our column base. I'm just going to use a circle. I'm going to start in this corner here just because it's easier to move around. and I'll type in 12 inches. And what you'll see, first of all, notice the broken glass look as I orbit my model. That look is telling me there's something called Z-fighting going on. For now, we can just ignore it because the surfaces will be covered. But if it does persist in situations you don't want it, you can delete the extra face on whichever object has it. I'm going to move this object over, and that's my reference line was awfully handy. Okay, now I don't need my reference line anymore, and I think I'm going to get rid of it. So what I'm going to do to edit the base group, just double click on it, and you see how it's everything else in the model is kind of gray. I'm now in block or group editing mode, and this gray outline defines the sort of limits of that block. And I can double click on the center rectangle to get the face and its perimeter, and then I'll hold down Shift to deselect the center face, and now I can just hit delete and it gets rid of that rectangle. Always a trick to quickly select and deselect objects. Anyway, to exit editing mode, you just click outside of the component, and now we have a nice clean plinth to put our temple on. I'll just click on the push-pull tool or tap the letter P. I'll drag my mouse up. Now, as we said before, if you know a dimension, you should type in the dimension rather than just kind of eyeing it. And I'm going to type in 15 feet and enter and get my nice column. Anytime you have something like a colonnade, you know that the columns are going to be repeated elements, right? That's the whole definition of a colonnade. I'm going to select the column, and I'm just going to use a selection window to do that. Right-click on it and choose Make Component. Okay, and what that will do, I'll call it column. This is just like creating a block in AutoCAD. You can replace the objects that you have with the selected objects, and there are other things you could describe it, which of course I'm not going to do. You could force it to be glued to a particular direction, which again I'm not going to do. And then there's this funky always face camera thing, which is great if you are creating a block of like a photograph of a person. Click Create, and now what happens is when I have one funny thing about SketchUp is there's no copy command. If you look around, hey, where's the copy command? You use the Move tool to make copies. Now watch what happens to my cursor. I'm going to tap the Alt button on a Mac or on a PC, the Control button. There's a little tiny plus sign that shows up. If I tap it again, the plus sign goes away. When I have that plus sign active, what it means is I'm going to click once to start the tool. Instead of just moving, it becomes the copy tool. And I'm going to move in the green direction. You see how it is going in the green direction. And I'll just type in 6 feet. Now, you might say, oh, am I going to have to do that for the whole front? Well, you don't. If you type in the letter X and the number of copies you want, I'm going to type in 6. You end up with 6 copies spaced 6 feet apart. Now the cool thing here, this is an array. I can change the distance. Let's say I change the distance. I would decide, oh, that's too far apart. I can type in 4 feet and they'll all change, and then I can change the number of total columns. See how it's really easy to make modifications, but it only works immediately after the command. I'm going to go back to 6 feet apart and 6 total copies, so I have 7 columns total. And now I want to have columns running up the edges here, so I'm going to select these outer ones, tap the Move command, tap the Alt or Control key, and then I'm going to move 6 feet. Now you'll notice that it does actually recognize that I'm making a 6-foot array here, so I can just click to space them 6 feet apart, and then type in times. I believe I need 13 total, so 12 to get me all the columns that I need. I can select this on this end, and I can use my Move Copy command. I'm just going to tap M to activate the command, and Alt to activate copy. Now I only need 5 because I already have the 6th one out at the end. And there you go. You have yourself the beginnings of a very nice colonnade. You might say, are we done? Aren't we done? Please, let's be done. Well, what I like to do, I'm going to tap the space bar to activate my Modify command, and I'm just going to make these columns into a group. And this is where being in 3D is super helpful, because I can use a crossing window to select all the columns, but I can orbit the model so that I just get the columns. See how nice and easy that is? And I'm going to turn them into a group. Just makes it a little easier. If I want to hide them, I can hide them a lot more easily. That is basically what the beginning of our existing conditions are. You can leave all this stuff on here for submission so that I can see what you've been up to.